Consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus are key ideas in the study of microeconomics, and I think they're not very well understood by most people taking these classes. There are a few basic underlying ideas you need to really understand before you can get the idea of why we care about this surplus and what it means. So let's talk about some of these ideas. Now, it all starts with your standard supply and demand graph, where you have demand as the downward sloping curve and supply as the upward sloping curve. But you need to understand why that is. And basically the idea here is that if we're talking about demand, we're talking about the willingness of people to pay for additional units of a product. So we call the willingness to pay, this additional willingness to pay, the marginal benefit of a product. Marginal means additional, and benefit, by that we mean in economics, the best way to measure how much something benefits you or what it's worth to you is to ask you the simple question, what's the most you'd be willing to pay to get it? And so when we're talking about marginal benefit, we're asking what's the most you'd be willing to pay to get one more unit. And we see on this demand curve, the first unit, the most this person would be willing to pay would be 16 units. The second unit, not $16 or 16 euros, whatever units of currency we're talking about. The second one, the most this person would be willing to pay would be 14. And the next one, the third unit, 12, etc. And so this tells us the most this person's willing to pay to get each of these units. Now that corresponds with the demand curve, because normally we think about a demand curve telling us at each price how many units is a person willing to buy. Well, if the most you're willing to pay for, say, the third unit here is $12, then that means that at a price of $12 you'll buy 3 units. You would not want to buy 4 units because the most you're willing to pay for the fourth unit is 10. Okay? So that's the idea of marginal benefit. It's just a slightly different way of thinking about what the demand curve actually tells us. So what about the supply curve? Well, in order to understand the idea of surplus with the supply curve, we need to think about it as telling us marginal cost. Marginal cost reflects the additional cost that a business faces when they produce one more unit. So, kind of similarly to what we were talking about with the demand curve, this tells us that the first unit produced would cost an additional $4. Now, this additional $4 is going to be for things that a business spends more on when they produce more units. I think about them as things like labor and materials. You need more workers or more worker hours to produce more units. So this business would be spending $4 on the first unit, and an extra $5 on the second unit, and an extra $6 on the third unit, etc., all the way up the line. Now, this also, another way of thinking about this marginal cost is in terms of willingness to accept. A business, the minimum they're going to be willing to accept in order for producing a unit of a good is that you have to at least cover the additional cost, the marginal cost of producing that unit. And that's why, on a supply curve, if a business happened to see that the price of the product they can sell it for is $6, this business would stop producing at 3 units, because if they produced the fourth unit, it would cost them $7 to produce the fourth unit, and they'd only be able to sell it for $6. So it doesn't make sense to keep going there. Okay, so now that we've got a fundamental understanding of what the supply and the demand curve tell us when we're thinking about decisions here, and so again, the demand curve tells us basically the value of each of these things to the consumer, and the supply curve tells us the cost of producing that good. Now, when we get to the equilibrium point here at a price of $8 or 8 euros and a quantity of 5 units, that's an equilibrium because that price of $8 is the price where the quantity people want to buy is 5 and the quantity businesses want to produce is 5. Now, what's also special about that equilibrium point here. I'll try to erase some of these extra dots without erasing my line. What's special about that equilibrium point is that it's where the surplus is maximized. What we call the total surplus. Now, what is the total surplus? Here is the simple way to think about what we're talking about here. In a market, we generate surplus whenever we can provide a high benefit. So let's look at this first unit. High benefit, in other words, high value to the consumer, $16, and it only costs $4 to produce that unit. That difference there is what we call surplus. Someone's getting a high value for something and there's a very low cost in producing it. The difference between the $16 in value created to someone minus the cost it costs to actually create that thing is surplus. It's benefit you're creating minus the cost of creating it, in other words. So here we would be getting 16 minus 4, or $12 in surplus right here. And for the second unit, someone would value it $14, and it would cost $5 to produce. So again, we're creating some surplus there whenever we produce that second unit. Or this might be the 2,000th unit, or the 2,000,000th unit. Similar kind of interpretation either way. And again, for the third unit, we have a high value and a low cost of producing it. High value, low cost of producing it for the fourth unit. The fifth unit, the value is the same as the cost of producing it, so nothing lost there, but nothing really gained either. So when we talk about the idea of total surplus is just this total area is the easiest way to calculate it. Total area of the difference between the benefit and the cost, and so we could calculate the area of this pink triangle, and that would give us an idea, an estimate of the total surplus created in this market. Let's do that. So this pink triangle, area of any triangle is 1/2 base times height. In this case, it makes it easy to think about the base as being this distance here. The distance between 18 down to 3 is a distance of 15. So that's the base. And the height of this triangle goes from the base to the highest point. And so the base to the highest point, all we're talking about is this 5 units, right? We're going from 0 to 5 on that axis. So the total surplus in this example would be 1/2 times the base, 15, times the height of 5. And that equals 37.5. Now, instead of just calling this 37.5, let's talk about the units. Now, if these prices are in dollars, then it would be $37.50. If the quantities were in millions of units, then this would be $37.5 million, right? It just depends on what the units are that we're talking about, but it's in a measure of value, some kind of currency. And again, what that $37.5 million would represent is the total difference between value created and the labor and material costs, things we call marginal costs, or if we add all of them up, we'd call them variable costs. Let's make this a little bit more explicit here. So if we add up all of those marginal costs, we'd be talking about the area of this shape down here, and we would call that variable costs. When you add up all the marginal costs, we call that variable costs. Why wouldn't we call it total cost? Well, generally there are some other costs that actually don't go up when you produce more units. We call those fixed costs. But in short, we call these the variable costs. And we could add that up by calculating the area of this trapezoid. And you can use the formula for the area of a trapezoid, Or you could just divide this shape into a triangle on top and a rectangle on the bottom and get that variable cost, all right? Now this total surplus, just to finish up this introductory video, normally what we would do is take this total surplus, this total pink triangle of 37.5 or 37.5 million, if we're talking about millions, normally we would divide this into two different parts. The top we would call consumer surplus, and the bottom we would call producer surplus. Now let's talk briefly about why and calculate them. The consumer surplus on the top, this is the amount of that extra value created that goes to the consumers. And the reason why is we're talking about the value to the consumer here. That's the demand curve. And the consumer gets value when they buy these things, but then they have to pay for them, right? We talked about that market price there was going to be $8. So the consumer surplus is the difference between the value the consumer gets and the price they have to pay for it. So that's why the consumer surplus is on the top. The producer surplus is the difference between the price they receive here, the $8, and the cost that they have to spend on these variable costs, the labor and materials costs on the bottom. So that's the producer surplus. Now we can see that the consumer surplus plus that producer surplus area gives us the total surplus. Now if we just want to calculate this surplus, the producer surplus is going to be this triangle down here in this particular case. So the producer surplus would be 1/2 times the base. We can think about the base as being the 5 there. And the height is going to be from 8 down to 3. So that's also 5. So the producer surplus here would be 1/2 times 25, which would be 12.5, or if it's millions of dollars, $12.5 million going to the producer. Now that producer surplus is not the same thing as profit. It's what the producer gets after they pay their variable costs out of their revenue, but then they still have to, out of this $12.5 million, they would have to pay for their fixed costs. Normally we'd think of things like rent. Anything for a business that does not increase as they produce more units. And the consumer surplus is going to have to be the rest of this $37.5 million, but let's calculate it directly. So the consumer surplus here is going to be 1/2 times the base, 5, times the height, and the height goes from 8 up to 18, so that's going to be 10. So 1/2 times 5 times 10 is going to equal 25. Again, it's in some units of currency, $25 or $25 million, if that's what we're talking about here. Last thing, let me just mention very briefly here is that we can also think about this rectangle on the bottom, the $8 times the 5 quantity, as being the total revenue that the business receives. And in this case, that would be 5 times 8, or $40 in total revenue. Now in the next video, we'll come back and we'll analyze what happens if for some reason we can't create this $37.5 million in total surplus. What if something prevents us from creating that much in total surplus? That's when we get into the idea of deadweight loss. I'll see you in the next video.